Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and joining me on today's show, my guest is a strategic communications executive and experienced journalist of over 2 decades. He is an author and professor with an extensive network in the national security communities, think tanks, and the private sector. He is also the founder of This Just In Media. But I could be here all day listing his background. So let me bring in the man himself and welcome to the podcast, Bryan Bender. Bryan, welcome.
Thanks, Andy. Good to be here.
It's good to have you on, Bryan. Lots to get through, and I wish we had 3 or 4 hours, to be honest, but I think it'll have to be a part 2 to get it through everything I would like to.
I'll come back. I'll come back.
Oh, well, I mean, give it till the end of the interview. You might not want to, but we'll see. But listen, I've given a bit of an overview of your background, Bryan, but do you want to just surmise for listeners who you are and kind of what's brought you to the UFO conversation?
Sure. So my name is Bryan Bender, and for much of my career, as you mentioned, I was a national security reporter. I was the Pentagon reporter for the Boston Globe for 14 years, and I covered, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the defense industry in the United States, sort of the national security apparatus. That was my beat for a long time. And then I was an editor and a reporter at Politico, also covering national security, but more through the lens of politics. And I guess it was 2017 when I got a tip. I was at Politico at the time. I got a tip that there was or had been in recent history a UFO research office in the Pentagon, and that the guy who was running that portfolio, someone that we all know very well now, Louis Elizondo, was frustrated, thought that the issue wasn't being taken seriously by his superiors, and he was getting ready to go public with those concerns. And, I admit, I was like a UFO office in modern day. I mean, I was aware of Project Blue Book and some of the historical efforts by, in that case, the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, to look into UFOs and the phenomenon. But I have to admit, all those years covering the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, the topic hardly ever came up. And if it did, it was never like a serious topic. It was sort of a fringe topic. And so I was wary, but I was intrigued. And then, of course, as I learned more, and some of my sources were, people that I knew their track records. I learned that there was a political angle to all of this, which was that the ATIP program, as it was called at the time, was started by then Senator Harry Reid of Nevada. So immediately, as a Politico reporter, it was like, okay, not just there's a UFO program, and $20-some million of taxpayer money was spent on that program, but it was kind of the baby of this leading politician in Washington. So that's when it became even more interesting as a story, as a news story for Politico. And that's sort of how I guess I fell into the rabbit hole. At the time, I don't think I thought it was going to be such a big story. But obviously here we are 5-6 years later, actually more, going on 7 years later. And, we just had a hearing this week, a public hearing on UFOs and the topic in Congress. And, I think, it's now not a marginal issue. It's a topic virtually like any other national security topic. Obviously, it has its own character to it, as you know. And there's a lot more unanswered questions, I think. Than I think many people would like. But it's a public policy issue that hasn't gone away. There's a lot of support in the Congress in particular, but also in the public to demand more answers. What do we know? When did we know it? And what are we doing now to develop more knowledge of what this may be or could be?
You mentioned you were part of that breaking story back in 2017, but I think it's fair to say, do you know what really threw me there, Bryan? Sorry, and this is more for the YouTube folks. You literally have the same drink I have. You've picked up a Starbucks cup, and it is, that is, other coffee brands are available, folks, but if you're on the YouTube, that's not by design. But when
that's good product placement. You should get like a credit there from Starbucks.
Mate, you've no idea, Brian. If the people who've listened to this for the 4 years plus it's been going, no Starbucks fuel me. So thanks to them if they want to sponsor the podcast. But back in 2017, you mentioned that story breaking. It's fair to say, though, I don't think this is unfair or downplaying your part. But if folks asks who were the journalists who broke that story, they're going to say Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, Helene Cooper, New York Times. Why do you think other journalists at the time who were part of it, or organizations like Politico, maybe don't get the same credit from that? Is it just New York Times as an organization kind of take the headlines there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, we published the article the same day. It was a Sunday, I remember. And, it was, I mean, we certainly got credit at the time, but, it was the New York Times. And of course, they had a larger readership. And I think it just, had a little more initial impact. Like, a front page story in the New York Times was not necessarily the, equal to the lead story on the website of Politico. But, that was, people have always asked me about the timing of that. Like, was there some coordination between the New York Times and Politico? And it really was a case of, it's very public now, but one of the key drivers of getting that story in the press was Christopher Mellon.
Yeah.
Who was working with Lou Elizondo. And obviously he was a former Pentagon official. I didn't know him well, but I knew of Chris from his previous days working in the Pentagon as an intelligence official. And, I think at the time, and Chris has talked about this, he was sort of shopping this story around. He wasn't sure who was going to bite. So he went to the New York Times. I think he went to the Washington Post. He went to us at Politico. He went to, I think, maybe even a couple other reporters. And I think what happened was at some point, I guess there was enough of a snowball effect that he was confident that the New York Times was going to go with it. And I think that was that was probably their top choice, if you will. But by that point, I had met with Elizondo. I had done some source reporting. I had confirmed Harry Reid's role in this. And I sort of had enough to go on. And then what happened was kind of in the fall of 2017, Chris went sort of quiet on me. He sort of disappeared. And that was my signal, I think, that, he must have decided to go with another publication.
Yeah.
Because while they had shown me the videos, the Tic Tac video, they didn't give them to me like they did the Times. They let me look at them as sort of additional information. And so I got a tip that, the Times was getting ready to run a story. And by that point, we had enough to go on. And so I said, let's not wait anymore. Let's go. And it just sort of turned out that we both went the same day, but it wasn't coordinated in any real way other than I didn't want to get beat. It was a competitive story. So as soon as I heard the Times was going with it, we were kind of ready to go too. And sort of the rest is history.
It is in history. We've just hit the 20th anniversary of the Tic Tac event. I think it's been extremely well told now. People listening to this, if you aren't aware of it and you're new to ufology, please go back and find another episode. With Brian's limited time, we won't go over exactly what happened. Dave Fravor encountering the Tic Tac, chasing it disappearing, all that good stuff. How do you view that event, Brian, now 20 years on in the grand scheme of ufology with your journalistic hat on?
Well, I mean, the Tic Tac event or events, which took place, and this is the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier off the coast of California in 2004, still is really one of the most compelling incidents of the last generation. I mean, it was a case that the Pentagon UFO office that we just talked about, this ATIP program, looked into heavily, gathering testimony from pilots, trying to gather as much data as possible from that day or a couple of days when they were exercising off California. And it's intriguing to me that that's the case, one of the primary cases, not the only one, but the main one that kind of drove a lot of this conversation and a lot of this debate in Washington over Are we doing enough? Do we know enough? We need to dig into this issue more. But yet it's like you pointed out, it's 2 decades ago. It's a long time ago. So, it's hard for me to think that was Chinese drones that long ago. I mean, if the Chinese had developed technology that advanced in 2004 and we still don't know it, it's like the biggest intelligence failure in history, right? And obviously it was the pilots. You mentioned David Fravor, who were involved in that incident, who've been very, front and center in this debate in the last few years. And so it was sort of a transitional event, I think. I mean, it took a long time for it to get out into the public and for us to really be fully aware of it. But the question in my mind is, what other incidents don't we know about? I mean, if something like that took place, and we do know about the USS Theodore Roosevelt, another aircraft carrier, that was more recently, I think 2019. And some pilots have talked about that. But how many more of these incidents have there been? And if the Defense Department has not been tracking them and compiling data, why are they not doing that? But yeah, I mean, the Nimitz case, the Tic Tac, probably now the most famous UFO incident of the last generation, right?
Yeah, you've got an extensive background in reporting on defence, don't you, as well? So this isn't just like UFOs and that's it. So that's a really interesting place to come from. One of the statements we hear quite a lot, similar to what you've said there, Bryan, is that these objects that are being seen aren't Chinese, they're not Russian. Can that be an oversimplification, though, that they could be potentially? And I wonder, you mentioned it would be the biggest, and Luis Elizondo just mentioned this in the hearings the other day. This would be the biggest, intelligence failure in history. 2004, you're 3 years, it was 2.5 years actually, away from 9/11, which would be labelled as the biggest intelligence failure in history, I believe, in US. That and maybe Pearl Harbor, I don't know. It wasn't that long since 9/11. Would things have been so tightened up by then that you could guarantee this wasn't China or Russia having developed something really, really spectacular?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think 2004, given the testimony, given what we know about what these orbs or Tic Tacs or whatever people call them, how they performed and the characteristics they exhibited, it would be pretty mind-boggling to think that was some foreign adversary that was basically stalking that aircraft carrier for a couple days. But you bring up a good point, which is, I think, and part of it is probably the fault of the media, because I ran into this challenge, as I was reporting on this story, not just in 2017, but in the years since, as the congressional hearings started and new offices were being set up in the Pentagon to gather data on this. First, there was the UAP task force, and then there's now the AARO office. I think oftentimes what gets mixed up in this UAP issue, or gets kind of lost in the shuffle, is that, I mean, UAP doesn't mean aliens. It means there's something up there and it's unidentified. We don't know what it is. And I think most experts would say that the vast majority of UAP, things that are reported that are unknown, are not anything all that sexy. They're drones, possibly Chinese, Russian, or some other entity that is using drones to spy. I've heard lots of reports about, container ships out in the Pacific unleashing like swarms of drones that are Chinese, that are, again, for intelligence gathering purposes or other things. So I think then there is this category that is probably a much smaller category, which is these things that exhibit aerodynamic characteristics that we truly can't explain. Like, we don't know how to do that. And I think that's one of the challenges going forward, is how do you separate what is normal stuff that's up there in the air, because we do live in an age where if you go on one of these apps where you can track commercial airline traffic, and it's amazing to look at like the United States at any given point in time. It's like covered hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of these things. Now think about all the drones that are up there. None of them file a flight plan. They're not being tracked. And so we live in an era where there's just a lot of shit up there. And most of it is our stuff or somebody else's stuff. But then there's this category, and I think the Tic Tacs and the Nimitz, I mean, obviously they fall into this category, and others that really are this sort of stubborn category that if that is Chinese, they have made an amazing breakthrough. And if it's not Chinese, is it our secret program? If it's not our secret program, then whose is it? And so I think the media tends to focus on that category, but tends to sort of gloss over, well, there's also lots of other stuff up there that are often reported and often are not really anything all that special.
Can I ask them, Bryan?
But there is no doubt the Chinese and the Russians and others, I mean, many countries are using drones now regularly as an intelligence gathering tool. So we can't rule out that some of this stuff, are drones, earthly drones.
It'd be really easy for me doing what I do here to come on and say everything's an alien spacecraft or mothership and not something else, but that's not fair. But I wonder, what did you think when Chris Mellon showed you those videos for the first time? The Tic Tac, were you thinking alien? Are you thinking drone? What was going on?
I mean, as you kind of alluded to, I mean, I've always been very clear that I'm not a ufologist. I was a national security reporter. I know how the military works. I know how the bureaucracy works. I think my initial reaction was not so much, oh, that must be an alien spaceship. It was, I was struck by how the pilots were reacting to what they were seeing. Because to me, that really made the story more credible. It's like, here are these fighter pilots that we trained for years. We entrust them with millions of dollars of taxpayer money and these advanced machines that they fly. And they were clearly spooked. Like, what is that thing? How is it doing that? Why is it stalking me? How can it go from 100,000 feet to the surface of the ocean in like a couple seconds? If I did that, my aircraft would explode. It would break apart. And so I think I came at it more as kind of a national security reporter would, which is, oh, wow, this is some sort of potential threat that's in a very restricted airspace, and the military doesn't know what to do about it. I mean, people, I think, don't really appreciate that probably the most protected element of the U.S. military arsenal is an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier, when it goes out to sea, is surrounded by a flotilla of other ships, aircraft, radars, submarines under the surface. I mean, that thing, it's an aircraft carrier battle group. An aircraft carrier doesn't go anywhere by itself. It goes with a bunch of other ships that defend it, because it's basically a floating military base. And the fact that these things could sort of run circles around that carrier battle group for so long, and there was nothing they could do about it. That's what struck me. It's like, if this was a threat, they'd be really vulnerable. Again, we don't know who was flying those things. We don't know if they were good, they were bad, or indifferent. But so I think that was my initial reaction. And then, of course, you go to the next step, which is, well, what could it be? Is it some secret U.S. plane that they're testing and they didn't tell you guys about? Or is it a foreign adversary? And so I very much was aware at the time that I'm not a UFO expert. I'm not going to explain the unexplainable. But what I can do as a reporter is sort of follow what I know, which is, we know there was a government program. We know they spent money. What did they spend money on? Who was in charge of it? It's kind of following the paper trail, because I felt like that's where I could add value. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an aerospace engineer. I'm not going to explain, sort of where that thing came from or how that thing was built. But I could explain through my reporting what we're doing about it, so to speak. So that's kind of really where I focused for for all of my years of reporting on this.
I'll drag you forward from 2017 then to 2023, and we get those congressional hearings where Dave Fravor of said Tic Tac event, Ryan Graves, both very well-known pilots by this point. They were public figures, but particularly in ufology, they were well-known. However, it's fair to say that the star of the day was David Grush, and particularly the comments he made around there being recovered non-human biologics and recovered non-human craft. What was your take on that day? Is that something you expected to ever see?
Well, it's interesting. When I first met Elizondo, he was fairly straightforward that, there, in his view, there was more to know, there was more to learn. He felt like he wasn't getting the bureaucracy to cooperate, to sort of answer the questions that he had. But it was clear to me even early on that he believed, and he never shared anything classified with me, but it was clear that he believed there was sort of a hidden trove of information about the phenomenon somewhere in the government, somewhere in the national security bureaucracy. And so from the beginning, that was always sort of there. It was in some ways the elephant in the room, right? But again, I knew I wasn't going to get at that, at least immediately, because I don't have a classified clearance. And those people probably who are protecting those deep, dark secrets aren't going to talk to a reporter. So, but, it's interesting you mentioned David Grush. I first connected with Grush a couple of years before he went public. When he was on the UAP task force, he actually was introduced to me by Elizondo. And he similarly never told me anything that was sensitive or classified but again, you got the impression that as he got more knowledgeable about sort of what was out there, and again, he was on this task force that had grown out of those stories in 2017 that was supposed to be gathering as much information as possible from within the government. I think it was clear back then that David Grush also believed there's some more there. And then I think, as the hearings that you mentioned took place in 2023, you have to remember that those hearings took place after many briefings behind closed doors with members of Congress and committees. So before we, the public, got to see that hearing, there were a lot of discussions behind closed doors where I think David Grush and Lou Elizondo and others, Chris Mellon, I think also made clear their view to some of these members of Congress that we think the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies are not completely forthcoming. We don't think they're telling us everything they know. And so that of course spilled out publicly in the hearings starting a couple years ago. But that's always been, like I said, the elephant in the room. The very strong belief by some of these you can call them whistleblowers, or some of these government officials that have come forward that they're convinced that there's more there, whether it's a UFO crash retrieval program or some piece of material that was recovered. I mean, you mentioned biologics. That's obviously very intriguing. I mean, that's alien bodies. That's what biologics means.
Yeah.
But we're still at a point in 2024 where we've not seen the evidence. And I don't think Congress has seen the evidence either. I mean, they have there's a lot of smoke here. And obviously the more smoke usually means the more fire there is. But, we still have yet to see or learn what were these programs, where were they, who ran them, what did they do? I mean, and I had a conversation with some staffers on the committee that just had the hearing this week, a few weeks ago. And even they were like, we're having this hearing mainly because we don't know how to get to that next level. We're the Congress, and we don't know how to bore down into these agencies and really figure out, is there truly that they're there? And I'm not even sure that, quite frankly, that some of the agencies that might have had these programs even know that they had these programs. Because again, are we talking about a current program? Or are we talking about something 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? I mean, I think there's this impression that, we watch a lot of Hollywood movies and we get this impression that the national security state is like some monolith. It's not. It's rabbit warren upon rabbit warren of compartments and secret worlds. And just because you and me and the guy next door ran some secret dark program 30 years ago doesn't mean anybody who works in those agencies today even knows about that. Because if we didn't tell them and they weren't part of that program, they wouldn't know. So we're sort of in some ways at this standstill, where maybe not publicly, but Congress is going to need people to come forward with the goods. Here is the name of the program. Here's where it was. Here's what it did. And why that hasn't happened, I don't know. I mean, you can believe that there's this cabal, as Lou Elizondo said this week, that is just sitting on this stuff. Or it's the greatest, I call it the galactic game of telephone, which is none of these guys that have come forward have said that they've seen this stuff themselves. But they talked to people who did, they knew people who did, very credible people. And I wonder, is it possible that some of this or all of this is water cooler talk, at the CIA or the Pentagon? I mean, those people are humans too. If you and I worked at the Pentagon and we were close, we were buddies, and we work on secret programs, and you said, hey, I heard from some guy that there's a secret UFO program out in the desert. You're a credible guy. I'd say, oh, wow, that's really interesting. And then I tell him, I heard it from this guy, and, it's really deep, dark secret. Like, at what point does it become conventional wisdom, but it's bullshit? It's, we still have to sort of wind back the chain of custody. Okay, where did that come from? Where did you learn that? Harry Reid, Senator Harry Reid, he's now passed away, but he used to tell me all the time that, they told me that all the UFO secrets went to Lockheed Martin so that the government didn't have them in their custody and they could hide them easier if they gave them to an aerospace company. And he would always say that, Lockheed. And then when I asked about Lockheed, they wouldn't let me go. They wouldn't give me the access. And I said, well, who told you it was at Lockheed? And he would always say, it was, very well-informed, credible people. Who? Can you tell me their names? Where did they work? And he never had a good answer. And so I was always sort of a little skeptical, like, is this really true? And then last thing I'll say, I know I'm droning on, is if there was a UFO crash retrieval program, and I'm not saying there was or there wasn't, I don't know for sure, but obviously these credible people say there was or there is, doesn't mean they ever had a UFO crash. I mean, you could conceive that if there's all these reports and there's strong suggestion that there's advanced craft out there, we don't know what it is, it might make sense to set up a program to collect stuff in the event that something fell down or something was recovered. And so just because there was a crash retrieval program or a research program doesn't mean that they had alien bodies or had a crash. I think that also is something that gets kind of lost in this. Just, the existence of a program to do that doesn't mean that they did it. They just set it up and said, let's gather information and see what we find. Like I said, still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, no, and I can totally get where you're coming from with that. That's very logical. And I'm along those lines of thinking where you have to say sometimes, just because they're saying this doesn't mean they've got X, Y, or Z. For the record, I do believe they've got at least something. I think there are elements of crash retrievals, bodies. Roswell, for me, yep, there was an incident at Roswell. Are we hearing the whole truth of this stuff? I think is a whole different matter. And is it easy to sometimes allow the lore and the history to take over and the mythology and have that ran as the real story, when actually maybe something did crash from somewhere else, but maybe it's not what we think, but that's what the public's been led to believe. You can go down all kind of rabbit holes with that kind of stuff. I suppose back to the nuts and bolts and the more political side of things, something that frustrated me with the hearings just this week, and we'll bring these in now, Brian, to talk about, is I asked Tim Burchett about David Grush. Now, that was June 2023, where they had Grush testify. And all the talk at the time was Grush needs to go into a skiff. They will sit in this secret compartmentalized room, and Grush can tell them what they need to know. Here we are, 18 months later almost, and they still haven't managed to get Grush into a room to do that. So now when I'm watching, and I felt I was underwhelmed at the hearing from the other day for all kinds of reasons we'll get into in a second. When I hear any modicum of answer that would be interesting, Lou Elizondo mainly answering, I would have to tell you that in a skiff. Well, they couldn't get Grush in a skiff. So what chance are they going to have getting anyone else in a skiff? It just seems whatever they're trying to get is being blocked at that level. And if Congress is being blocked, then how is anyone going to get anywhere with this?
Well, I also think it's important to talk about a little bit, and this is kind of process and almost like American government 101, but it's important. And I think even many of us, who are steeped in this world forget this, which is the committee that held the hearing yesterday or Wednesday, House Government Reform and Oversight Committee, or House Oversight and Reform Committee. That's not the Intelligence Committee. It's not the Armed Services Committee. It is a committee that has a wide jurisdiction, basically to look into just about anything they want about government operations. It's supposed to be kind of a watchdog committee that, holds federal agencies accountable. And I think one of the problems is that this committee and these members don't normally have access to classified information because it's not really part of their purview on that committee. The Intelligence Committee, if they wanted to get David Grush in a skiff, and I'm almost positive they have, they could, because that's what the Intelligence Committee does. The Intelligence Committee itself has a skiff. It's in the Capitol. It's a room that nobody can go in unless you're cleared for it. So I think the problem is more jurisdictional in Congress. I think there's a reticence to give someone like Congressman Burchett the same kind of access to the crown jewels of secrets that the Intelligence Committee has. And part of it's his own fault, because he's out there making wild claims, accusing the Pentagon of lying to the American people and hiding alien bodies and all kinds of stuff. And, I think they're basically saying, we don't trust this guy. And I think that's why it's been such a delay in getting him the access he wants. He's also just simply not on the right committee that is supposed to actually have oversight of intelligence programs. And again, this House committee, I think, has done good work. And I think much of the reason why they've gone after this topic and they've held these hearings, because this is the second hearing under that committee. And of course, all these committees have different subcommittees that oversee different things. Mm-hmm. But they've gone after it because I think there's a personal interest of some of the members. And I think they also feel like, the other committees with jurisdiction are not doing enough. I mean, the Senate Intelligence Committee's done virtually nothing on this. As far as we know, and again, they would really be the committees that ostensibly could really get to the bottom of this if they wanted to. And so,
sorry, Bryan.
So that's just some context.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask, is that the committee, though, that have a hearing on the 19th of November now, which is Senator Gillibrand, and they are going to be overseeing AARO, and it's basically a review of AARO's performance?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay. And, Senator Gillibrand has been very active as well, and she does sit on some of the key committees. But, there's also the problem of, you can't hold a public hearing and talk about secrets.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of these questions that got asked, they're like, well, I can tell you that in a skiff. I can tell you that in a skiff. But that doesn't mean that behind closed doors, if they want to, certainly some lawmakers can get answers. But again, who's got the answers? I think that's kind of the $1 million question, because you could call the head of the Pentagon, you could call the chief intelligence officer of the Pentagon. And by the way, there was a hearing in 2022 with, I think it was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Ronald Moultrie, the Deputy Director of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And that was an interesting hearing. And you got the impression that they didn't know jack about UFOs. Like they didn't know much about even just basic history. And some of the more compelling cases throughout history. I mean, they were just completely unaware of them. And it's not really because they're not smart or they're not good people. It's just, they have a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things they have to oversee. And so I think there's this false perception also that you could call the head of these agencies and demand answers and they would just have them. I mean, these are large organizations with all kinds of different fiefdoms. And I think the real challenge is if there is real programs that fall into this category, where are they? How do you get to them? How do you learn about them? And I don't know that the public ever gets to learn about them. But I think at minimum, the Congress should know about them. I mean, that's their job, right? They're supposed to be doing oversight. And I think that's what's driving a lot of these members of Congress. I think they feel like we're supposed to be in charge. We're the people's representatives. And you're hiding stuff from us. It doesn't mean that we're going to release it all to the world necessarily. But I think they would like to know more and decide, is this something that should be more public or not?
So from what you're saying then, Brian, is it almost a case that these congressional hearings, as nice as they are to have on the calendar, are ultimately not the way to go to get any sort of real political progress on this? And I mean, I'm stopping short of saying they're a waste of time, but is that potentially the case?
I think they're an effective way to keep the heat on, to keep the Pentagon and the agencies that may be able to answer these questions on their toes. I mean, if you don't have these hearings, I think you run the risk that the issue kind of just sort of falls away as a priority. And, the Congress, to its credit, has done quite a bit. You mentioned the AARO office. They've set this office up. It's got a mission. It's got a budget. It's supposed to be gathering data, not just current sightings or incursions of military airspace by unidentified craft, but it's also supposed to be going back and looking in history. What other programs might there have been? When were they? Why were they? And so, none of that happens quickly. Unfortunately, I think people want it to happen like right now, but I think these hearings do serve a purpose because they keep the issue on the front burner and they make it harder for the Pentagon or the intelligence agencies to just wiggle out of this and say, we're not going to answer your questions, Congress. But the real answers, I mean, I was hopeful that last year when Senator Chuck Schumer had proposed I might be getting it wrong, but some sort of national commission on this topic, that maybe could have been a kind of a different approach to getting some answers. That proposal was killed.
Was that the review board?
That was the review
presidential
board.
Review board.
Exactly. And that never got into the final legislation. Yeah. I think there was quite a bit of pushback on that. But there's a model for that. And I think it was actually modeled on it. But, in the early 1990s, after the movie JFK came out, which of course was sort of filled with conspiracy theories, but there was a sort of public push for more answers. Like, does the government perhaps still have secrets related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And they created the JFK Assassination Records Review Board that resided at the National Archives, but it was run by a federal judge. And they basically had the authority to go to all of the secret agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and basically say, what do you got that might shed any new light on what happened in November 1963 and who might have been responsible? And, that's a process that went on for years. It was legislation that was authored by John Glenn, the former astronaut who was in the Senate. And I think a lot of people would say that's a good model. The one thing that board didn't have that this board would have to have, I think, would be subpoena power. would have to be able to subpoena these agencies to force them to cooperate, because I covered that board a little bit when I was at the Boston Globe, and there were still lots of stories about agencies not giving up information, not cooperating, basically saying, sorry, we looked in our archives, but we don't have anything. And then there was no accountability. There was no way to say, well, how can we be sure you're not just, BSing us? And so, but I do think some sort of national review board with some real leading figures on it who have classified experience or have security clearances would be maybe the one way that you could force these agencies to cough up maybe what they might know or what they've not revealed. And then, of course, the other possibility, I wouldn't bet on it, is that the president could order that this stuff be revealed. And, President Trump is known to be unpredictable, and he will be president again come January. And, this is a topic that I don't know if it's of immense interest to him, but he certainly was very interested in the JFK issue and promised that he was going to release everything. And of course, he didn't because somebody convinced him not to. But so, yeah, I don't know where things go from here, but I do think more hearings are good. I mean, they can't hurt. I would like to see, though, a different cast of characters. I mean, we need some new faces, some new voices in this debate. And, there was all this talk that there was these whistleblowers that were going to come forward, more David Grushes. Where are they? I mean, it's been a couple of years now, and we haven't seen them. We haven't heard from them. Maybe they're talking behind closed doors and they're telling the Congress what they know, but certainly we don't know yet.
There's a lot we could go into there, and I'm going to hold you to that part too, because we don't have too long left, and I want to ask you a few questions and talk about Beyond just before we finish. Couple of listener questions I'll pick out and keep the rest for next time, folks. So don't worry, Bryan will be joining us again, he's promised. Christy asked, does Bryan think that Trump will help or hinder disclosure? You've kind of touched on it there, but what do you think Trump's going to do for this topic?
I mean, I think one thing that's certain about President Trump is that he likes to resist convention. I mean, he likes to do things differently. And he also, I think it's pretty clear, doesn't have the highest regard for America's intelligence agencies, for American bureaucrats. And so I think there is a chance that Trump, especially this is going to be his last term as president, he may try to move the ball on not just this issue, but others as well, where he thinks that the government has not been transparent enough, has not been truthful enough. I think, it's hard to say whether he will be good or bad. I mean, he's going to have a lot on his plate. I'm not sure that this topic will be high up on the priority list in the first 100 days, but you could imagine as his term goes on that he may want to be playing some sort of role in moving this forward, especially if he thinks, there's some public good in revealing more information. But it's hard to know. I mean, none of us are really good at predicting what Donald Trump is going to do.
No, that's certainly true.
I don't think Donald Trump would be good at predicting what Donald Trump is going to do.
You took the words out of my mouth, Bryan. I got a genuinely anonymous one here. This is a question. I'm not just saying it's anonymous for the sake of it. It did come from anonymous. So with the US welcoming back, and it says you know who, but I'm guessing they mean President Donald Trump, should we be wary of any elected officials leveraging a pro-disclosure platform to achieve other political goals? And as a thought experiment, what do you imagine this would look like? I suppose that's quite interesting given after the hearings, Nancy Mace, who was a bit of a star of the day for most of us, very quickly online put a whole host of tweets out, whether it was her or a staffer or someone who runs our social media. And some people weren't too keen on how much she put out. And then the T-shirts started going on sale. And then other folks, I think, have done the same thing as well. What do you think about politicians at that level or any level using disclosure as, a campaign issue?
I mean, I think it's on some level, Tim Burchett has been using this issue as a maybe not to run on, but as a sort of a tool to wield, to badger the government. So yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there's going to be some that are going to maybe try to use this issue. You mentioned Nancy Mace, but I don't see that as some sort of concerted effort by anybody but a few individuals here and there that think there's some mileage that they can get out of it. And let's face it, I mean, I don't know Nancy Mace personally, but there's some kooks in Congress too. I mean, not every member of the 435 members of the House of Representatives are, completely moored to reality. And so, I mean, they're human beings too, and they have their own agendas. And, but I do think there's reason to hope that this issue is not going to just be shunted aside. I think the questions are going to continue to be asked. And I had an editor back in my early days as a reporter, and I often quote him, but he once said, the biggest stories often ooze out. They don't just blow the door down. They little by little by little, they come out. And then one day you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I didn't realize, but we've learned so much. And sometimes I think in the moment you feel frustrated, like we're not getting any answers. We don't know where things are going. But this story, if there is a there, I don't see how it stays secret forever. I just don't. But again, it's probably not going to just fall in our laps one day with, somebody's going to dump the big pile of secret documents on the table and say, here's all the secret alien body programs and here's the map to go find them. But, but little by little, I think it's going to be harder to resist some level of transparency or greater transparency. But again, it all depends on whether there really is a paper trail to follow back to some of these programs. I mean, I don't think if there was a secret alien body hidden somewhere that they kept a lot of notes. They probably didn't. There's probably not a lot of paper trail there. And obviously, if there's people who worked on it, they can be under oath and they can give personal testimony. But I think the truth is probably going to be something less than that, though. I think it's going to be that our government had some really intriguing pieces of the puzzle. But maybe they haven't put the puzzle together yet either. And that's one of the reasons why they don't want to talk about it. I think that's in some ways more likely, that they do have really interesting, provocative things, and maybe even material, but they don't really 100% know where it's from and how it came to be. And sometimes in the intelligence business, being secret is out of a lack of knowledge, not because you have all the answers and you don't want to share it with the world or your enemies. It's because you're still trying to figure it out. And I have reason to believe that it's more that. It would still be very intriguing stuff. But the idea that the U.S. government has all the answers and it's just been sitting on it and doesn't want to tell Congress and doesn't want to tell the American people, I just find that hard to believe. But I don't find it hard to believe that they have come across some very interesting things that seem to suggest a non-human origin. And they haven't really figured it all out. How does it work? Where did it come from? But I don't know. I mean, maybe they figured it all out and it's now in the hypersonic missile and it's in the satellite and we've used the technology for our own purposes. But that seems to me to be a little sci-fi world. But I don't know. We live in a world where the science fiction is becoming more reality, right?
Absolutely, and it's hard to tell the two apart these days. And one of the ways we're trying to do that is obviously get more of the public involved, more public awareness, more pressure on those organisations, on governments, on political figures. Beyond UFOs and the unknown has been a big part of that, Brian. You were a part of that series. I've had the directors for it on. That was the finale, Sunday, 17th of November on MGM Plus will be streamed. I've seen the first 3 episodes, Brian. I've not seen the 4th because that wasn't given to me. But how did you find being a part of that series? And to finish off, what do you want folks who watch it to take away?
Well, I participated in it because I was impressed by some of the other voices that they were able to get. I mean, the other people that are interviewed there, these are all, I would say, credible scientists, policymakers, former military pilots. I enjoyed the show. I mean, sometimes I cringed as I was watching it because it goes in places, it goes well beyond anything that I feel like I'm knowledgeable about or could ever report on, because you just wouldn't have enough factual information to make a news story out of it. But you listen, it's an innately fascinating subject. It always will be. And I think more shows like this that raise questions, but also advance the serious scientific attention that this topic needs. And I think that, and maybe that's the way to close today. I think the one thing we have succeeded in, if you're a supporter of more transparency and more knowledge, is that the topic now is not as fringy as it was 5 or 6 years ago. You can go into this as a discipline if you're a scientist or an engineer, and you may be laughed out of some rooms, but you're not going to be laughed out of every room. And there are now places like MIT and Stanford and places like that take this topic seriously. And the truth is, we're probably going to find the truth eventually on our own, not by waiting for the CIA to tell us or waiting for the military to give us their deep, dark secrets. Humanity now has such access to technology and knowledge outside of the government sphere that if we had a real coordinated scientific approach to studying the phenomenon, maybe we could come up with the answers, and we could tell the Pentagon and the governments of the world to, go screw themselves. We could find out for ourselves. Maybe that's how we find out.
That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a Tic Tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne